graphical maps and topographical maps. Think of it this way. The geographical map tells you where you are on the planet. And think of words like geography and geology. But a topographical map, and that's what you're looking at now, indicates the lay of the land. And so if you see in the lower left-hand corner the Sahara in Egypt, and next to it the Sinai Desert and the Arabian Desert, obviously deserts are going to be relatively flat. But if you look north and west, think of it this way, if you will, to the right of the map that you see, you can see texture. You can see mountains, a topographical map. And so when you're studying this portion of the far eastern Mediterranean, the spit of land that is known as the Aegean, that's between modern-day Greece and modern-day Turkey, you'll see Troy up there. This is a story that is largely about traveling by water and about controlling the Aegean for trade, Trade. So having looked at this map, we're in the period of time, very roughly on the timeline, in what's called the Bronze Age. So the Stone Age is prehistory, where people used stone to make weapons and other implements. Now we're in the Bronze Age, very, very roughly from 3000 to 1000 BCE. And then after that comes the Iron Age. Not going to get too much into the Iron Age today. Now, of course, we're living in the Information Age. And if we look at the next map, pulling the camera out a little bit, what we see here are a whole series of little kingdoms. So in this period of time, when we're talking about the battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, and I'll say in a moment what I mean by that, we're not dealing with city-states. We're far away from the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. That's the 400s and the 300s BCE. In the 400s, for instance, was when the Acropolis was hashed out and the beautiful building called the Parthenon, which still stands, was put up in Athens. We're far earlier than that period. But you can see now in this map, there are many more little islands. And so what you really had in this period of time was a confederation of small Greek kingdoms that were organizing themselves in an invasion fleet to tackle this area called Troy, okay? And this period of time is after time immemorial when mythology began. If you look at the bottom of your map, you'll see an island called Crete. Maybe some of you have been to the island called Crete. And the first culture of the Greeks was the Minoan culture. And that's the culture that was centered around, you know, the story in Crete, right? About a famous city that was also dug up called Knossos, Knossos. And in the rabbit warren underneath was a famous animal called a minotaur that had the bottom part of the body was human and the top part of the body was a bull. And that rabbit warren, that maze, was built by a famous craftsman named Daedalus. And to escape the island, Daedalus fashioned wings that were made of eagle's wings and wax, and he and his son Icarus used them to flop away, to fly away. And Daedalus told Icarus, don't go too close to the sun. Of course, Icarus goes too close to the sun, the wax melts, the feathers fall apart, and that becomes an analogy, a metaphor for not trying to go too high. Why do I bring that up? Because Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey are also metaphors to talk about virtue and vice, and this is something that the Greeks were fascinated with. So that Minoan culture collapses, is destroyed, probably because of a series of earthquakes and also what we today would call tsunamis that wiped out the coastline. It is believed, for instance, that the lost islands of Atlantis is an allegory for probably some islands that was overwhelmed by the water in this combination earthquake tsunami. And so the lower part of the Minoan culture disappears, and now comes the culture that is our focus for the Trojan War, and that is the Mycenaean culture. Some of you may have been to Greece and taken a day trip from Athens to a place called Mycenae. Mycenae was the kingdom, the capital of the kingdom of a man named Agamemnon. And Agamemnon was essentially the Eisenhower of the NATO, of the Allies, who brings together this confederation of Greeks to sail off to go after Troy. Now, a word about this phrase, Greeks. If you and I time traveled back then and we met someone from this period and we asked her, "Who are you?" she would never say, "I'm Greek. I'm a member of the Greeks." She would say, "I'm Corinthian. I'm Theban. I'm Olympian. I'm Spartan. I'm Athenian." Maybe they would have identified by a region in the same way that we say, "I'm from northern India, I'm from southern Italy, I'm from the northwest of the United States." And so when I say the Greeks, in Homer, sometimes they refer to themselves by these regions, like the Achaeans, the Danans, the Argives. So in this Mycenaean age, or the late Bronze Age, somewhere around, let's say, 1600 to 1100 BCE, we see competition for the Aegean. And the two big players are these different kingdoms in Greece, and Mycenae being the largest as kind of the leader, and then Troy. Now, who is trading with whom? Well, I'm going to go back one slide, and you're going to see places like Babylon, modern day Baghdad, and Assyria. You may recognize the word Nineveh for those of you who know the Bible or Hebrew scripture. Jonah falls into the belly of the whale because he doesn't want to go to Nineveh to preach, a city so big that it took him 3 days to walk through. So all of these groups, the Aramaeans, the Philistines, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, are all trying to control trade. And a strategic regional center for them is this city called Troy. So you see Troy there in the upper left-hand corner, and in this next slide in the upper right-hand corner. And Troy, whose king was Priam or Priam, kind of sits in between the world of the Greeks and the world of what we today call the Middle East. And so Troy was particularly better suited than any of those other towns that you see on the coast, because Troy had a very, very big and deep harbor. And Troy was also at the top of a very large flat area. We would call it a plateau with cliffs that fell off. So good to trade and good to defend. And so Troy seems to have been something of a middleman between the Greeks and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Sumerians. Not important in and of itself, but having a very good geographic and topographical spot. Troy probably was not very large, certainly not as big as the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, but it is that strategic site. Some other words, by the way, that you'll come up with Troy when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and even some of the Roman sources later referring back. Troy, we can hear the word Tarusia, but we also get another word for it in sources. Wilusa, Wilion, Ilium, Ilium, and that gives us the word Iliad, and we'll get to that in a moment. So a middleman probably getting squeezed because the Hittites and the Sumerians and the Assyrians on the east and the Greeks to the west want to control that area there. So something happened in Troy. We're going to get to the archaeology later, But something happens in Troy in a window that we can date pretty closely to 1270 to 1240 BCE. What we can't tell from the archaeological layers, and remember when you dig in archaeology, when you go down into the ground, the further down you go, the further away you go, and we can see levels there. In that level of 1270 to 1240, there is evidence of fire. We have essentially burn marks. We have evidence of earthquake, and we have evidence of attacks. Why attacks? Because bodies are not buried in a systematic way. Now the question becomes the chicken and the egg. There is no way that we can figure out, even with all of that evidence, was this area hit by an earthquake that weakened it so it was easier to attack? Or was it attacked and then the earthquake finished it off? There is no way we have of figuring it out, but we do have that window. Okay, part one over. We know where we are in place and time. Now, let's talk about Homer. So we date Homer, this very traditional picture that you see in front of you, we date Homer to somewhere around the 8th century BCE. So that's about 750, just put it in the middle, BCE. Somewhere between the Mycenaean period and this period, 750 BCE, writing disappears. In all of those layers, we have no evidence of writing. We think that literacy may have actually disappeared, and what substitutes for literacy? Oral tradition. True in many cultures, and think about all the stories you tell in your family. And the people who told those stories, here's a word that might be familiar to us. We call Shakespeare the bard. Another word might be rhapsode, from which we get the word rhapsody, because many of these stories were set to music. Think of how you learned your alphabet. Not A, B, C, but A, B, C, D, E, F, G. If I asked you to write down lyrics right now, it would be very hard. So what do? You start singing the song in your head. So music allows you to remember lots and lots of words, and the rhythm allows you to learn it as well. So that's why we think these people that we call epic poets were essentially musicians and singers. Think of medieval troubadours, and you have a sense of what we're talking about here. Why is Homer called the blind poet? A few reasons we might conjecture. One is, if this is an oral tradition, it matters not if you have sight. What you need is hearing and the ability to speak or sing. But also in the ancient world, and this is true in many cultures as well, people who had an inner eye, someone who had a particular perception, a prophet, a priestess, was often depicted as not having physical sight because they had a deeper sight, if you will, an insight that made them not need to have physical sight. So we think that this story was told recounting some event from 1270 to 1240 again and again and again, and of course embellished in the same way that you and I, come on, let's admit it, embellish stories. It's always fun when somebody calls us out on that, until a point came where somebody decided to write this down. If Homer was cited, or the person representing Homer might be a composite figure, he could write it down himself. But if he did not have physical sight, he could simply have spoken it, and someone could have transcribed his words. So essentially, he is dictating. And some linguists speculate that the Greek language that you might have studied was invented in order to write down the story of Homer, because we don't have anything between that period of about 1200 until the period of about the 700s, again, all BCE. And what we find in that story are two things. We find objects that we can date to the 700s, and we find objects that we can date to the 1200s. So it's kind of like what I'm doing right now. I might be telling a story about Homer, and I might say, for instance, one of the attractions of Homer is that there's this elemental level of conflict, good and evil, older and younger. And then I might say, it's like Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. Now, Homer would have no clue of what I'm talking about, but you do. So Homer, or whoever Homer was, and I'm just going to keep saying Homer, Homer was describing these events of 400 and 500 years past, but also making them relevant to the people in front of him by saying, it's like Menelaus was like this guy. Achilles was like this woman. They worship gods in a temple that's like the one down the block. So we have elements in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two great works attributed to Homer, of the earlier period where some conflict might have occurred, probably did occur, and his own period as well. So now let's talk about the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, when I talk to people about the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're kind of like, is that like reading Shakespeare? And I don't know how I pledge my troth, and I don't know what all those words mean. Relax. There's plenty of ways to read the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were poems. Yes, certainly they were poems, but there are prose translations of those poems. You don't have to know Greek. And if you're not comfortable reading poetry, then get a prose translation. There's no problem whatsoever with that. The two major works attributed to Homer are very, very different. They are first the Iliad and then the Odyssey. The Iliad is the story of the last 50 days of a 10-year war. The Odyssey are all of the Hollywood stories connected to it. The Iliad begins with a word that I think makes this story so attractive. It's translated as anger, wrath, ire. It's a very passionate word. And a word like wrath, the wrath of Achilles, brings you right in. Everything that you could want in a story is in the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is one of the reasons why I think it endures. Hate and love, love and lust, passion and silence, fear and loathing, cowardice and courage, adventure, the gods and human beings, natural disasters, cunning and deception. It makes a great story, and that's why people have grabbed onto it. Much of what I'm talking about in a very intimate way is in the Iliad. The Iliad and the Odyssey are very different reads. If you like really intense, character-driven fiction, then read the Iliad first. The Iliad tells the following story. Why is Achilles so angry? One of the translations is rage, because Agamemnon, who is the king kind of in charge, that Eisenhower of NATO figure, has taken away from Achilles a woman that Achilles has stolen. Now, let's be very honest. You know, the texts say war bride. We're talking about a sex slave here. We're talking about a woman who was stolen to be a sexual slave. And Achilles takes her as war booty, as the spoils of war. But Agamemnon, as the overlord, says, well, no, I'm bigger than you. like they treat her like garbage, like she's a pair of shoes. And because of this, Achilles begins to brood, well, I'm not going to fight anymore. Well, Agamemnon's in trouble because he's been fighting a war for 10 years and he needs Achilles and Achilles' great warriors. All of these kings had armies, and Achilles had what we would call the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, the elite. And so they have to come to some sort of compromise, and that's based on drama. If you like movies with lots and lots of action, if you like 700-page novels that are multi-generational, then the Odyssey is for you. At the end of the Trojan War, Odysseus has annoyed the gods. And so the gods say, you've been away 10 years, you're going to be away 10 more. And as Odysseus is going through all of his travels, and he meets the Cyclops, and he meets the Sirens, and he meets Circe, and he meets all of those people and all of those wonderful stories from our childhood, at the end of those days, everybody has a meal, everybody has a drink, and they say, hey, Odysseus, tell us about the Trojan War. What was it like when? And he says, oh, well, let me tell you. Sometimes bards come in and speak. It's almost as if Homer has planted a cameo, because at one point, Odysseus hears a story that a bard is telling about a long ago war. And Odysseus says to the bard, in kind of the Homer cameo, wow, that is amazing. You paint such a wonderful word picture. It's as if you were there or you spoke to somebody who was. So if you really wanted to put the events of this 10-year war together, A, B, C, D, E, you would have to cut the Iliad and the Odyssey up and put it in order. If any of you saw the two Godfather movies in the 1970s, Godfather 1 occurs and Godfather 2 takes place before and after Godfather 1. Sometimes they cut them up and put them in order. It destroys the second movie because it's the flashbacks that inform us. And that's what's great about the Odyssey. The Odyssey is full of flashbacks. In fact, the Trojan horse does not appear in the Iliad. The Trojan horse appears in the Odyssey and then in a later work as well called the Aeneid. Now, a word about Odysseus, from which we get the word Odyssey, from which we say, oh, it took me so long to get home. What an Odyssey in the airport, right? He's kind of a creep. He's very cunning, and his wife, Penelope, is very, very smart too. She's keeping things going back at home. That's the denouement of the Odyssey, when he comes home and takes back his crown from the suitors. But in fact, Odysseus is no hero. He had, at the beginning of the story, tried to avoid going on the Trojan War. He didn't want to go. Constantly, he is lying and being deceitful. When he falls in love with Calypso, he says, oh, well, it wasn't my fault that I fell in love with her. She's so beautiful. I may have stayed with her, but I never consented. I know that I fall for these goddesses, but it's not my fault. It's that they're so beautiful. There's no way I can do that. In fact, the Trojan horse is his idea. The ultimate deception, right, is the Trojan horse. So he's a rather interesting character as well. So that phrase, cunning Odysseus, takes us to another point about Homer, and that is, how do you remember the equivalent of 9,000 lines of verse? How do you fill out the verses, like when you have iambic pentameter in Shakespeare? The answer is you have kind of these catchphrases that fill out lines. So for instance, Odysseus is frequently called cunning Odysseus. The god Apollo is typically called swift darting Apollo. If you've been to the Aegean Sea, especially in winter, if you go in the summer, it's got this very deep turquoise blue. But if you go in the winter and it's very stormy, You'll understand Homer calling it the wine dark sea. He refers to rosy fingered dawn. And so these, we believe, are what are called mnemonic devices in order to help you remember all of these words. So we believe that he was onto something. And before we get there, let's go to our third part. And that is the story. So it begins with a wedding. And it is the wedding of a man and a female goddess. The man is Peleus, and the female goddess is Thetis. And Thetis is a sea goddess, an ocean nymph, as she is sometimes called. And all the gods get together. By the way, Peleus and Thetis will be the parents of Achilles, the star of the Iliad, and it is Thetis who basically condemns Achilles to die by giving him the Achilles heel, because she dips him in a river in order to keep him safe, but she holds him by the heel, and that's where he is eventually killed by an arrow that gets, we imagine, like a blood infection. It's that wedding. And they invited all of the gods except for one, a goddess by the name of Eris, E-R-I-S, Discord. And she is well named because she is so angry that she has not been invited, that she's going to mess things up. And so she rolls into the wedding feast a golden apple. And the apple is inscribed to the fairest. And the god Zeus, the super duper god Zeus, picks it up, and three women want the title the fairest. And Zeus is in a very bad place, because the three women are his wife, Hera, his daughter, Athena, and his mistress, Aphrodite. And so he says, no, I am not going to decide. Let's let Paris decide. He's a prince of Troy. He's visiting Greece for the wedding. Let's let him try. So the three women offer him bribes. Hey, says Hera, Paris, if you give me that golden apple inscribed to the fairest, I will make you ruler of all that you can see. And Athena says, hey, if you give me the golden apple, I'll not only give you wisdom, but I will give you military might. And Aphrodite says, if you give me this apple, I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris takes the most beautiful woman in the world, who is named Helen. Helen is married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and Paris and Helen run away. So Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, should really be called Helen of Sparta, because she was not Trojan. She was Greek, or specifically Spartan. So you can see how important this story is, that there is a painting from 1569 about the judgment of Paris, and you have Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera there, but the award here goes to Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. So you could see how these stories perdure. So here we have Paris taking Helen, and this image comes from the 5th century BCE. You see Paris grabbing the hand of Helen, and in a style of a painting that's only about 200 years old, this story endures again and again. So it tells us the enduring element of this tale. Now they arrive, and here we have a medieval manuscript, illuminated, the story being told in the Middle Ages. And in order to get a favorable sailing wind, Agamemnon, again, one of these elemental parts of the story, must sacrifice his wife, his daughter, Iphigenia, to get a fair wind. This is how horrible, bloody this story is. And again, on the left-hand side, a classical image. On the right-hand side, a medieval image. In battle, here is a Renaissance image where Achilles is going too far and Athena is pulling Achilles away during this 10-year war. Why, by the way, 10 years? Well, it turns out that we find other stories from this period where 10 is kind of like, if you see the word 1,000 in the Bible, that means a whole heck of a lot of time. And so there seems to have been an expression in this period, 1 year and another year and another year till 10 had passed. So 10 years is probably where that comes from. And then Achilles is really going to go into battle. And here is an example of Hephaestus Vulcan in the Roman system making Achilles' armor. The walls of Troy not looking as if they did in 1200 BCE, but looking as if they did in the late Middle Ages, the story being told again and again. And then finally, after 10 years, the final battle that kind of has to take place between the champion of one and the champion of the other. So Achilles is the champion of the Greeks. Here is Hector, the champion of the Trojans, and his wife Andromache in a romanticized painting on the left, in a modern painting on the right, begging her husband, don't go fight Achilles. There is no way you can. And Hector arming for battle, for that battle where he knows he probably will die. Again, a medieval image. And here, once again, a classical image and a 20th century drawing of the battle of Achilles chasing Hector. He will kill Hector. He will run Hector's body around the walls for about a week, heroically dying in this medieval image on the left, in this contemporary image on the right, dragging the body around. And then finally, the Greeks decide the only way we're going to make this work is if we have a trick. We're going to fashion, as Athena is doing in the upper left-hand corner, a horse, and we're going to hide people inside the horse. What happens is that the horse is found. Most of the Trojans say, great, they left, and they left us a horse. Isn't this a wonderful idea? They're noting that, we are so great and so wonderful. And Laocoon, who is a priest of Troy, comes out and he says, beware Greeks bearing gifts. And Poseidon needs Laocoon to shut up because Poseidon is on the side of the Greeks. He needs that horse inside. So he sends two snakes to go out and kill Laocoon, killing his two boys as well. This is snakes in a Roman copy of a Greek original. That statue was dug up in 1506, and you can see some of the kind of sculptural torque. If you look at the body, the mid-body of Laocoon and the mid-body of Eve, you can see that kind of sculptured look. There is the Trojan horse in action. And of course, lots and lots of replications of the Trojan horse. This one on the right from southern Spain, the area called Granada and Seville, known for its oranges and lemons. And a lot of cartoons have always tried to figure out, what if somebody had to go to the bathroom? What if somebody had to smoke a cigarette? Would the Greeks have been allowed to get in? And who's inside, by the way? It's Odysseus. Odysseus's idea. And even pizza may have been delivered in case they couldn't get in with the horse. This is my favorite image from Toronto. There was an exhibit on the Trojan War at a museum in Toronto. This is the subway stop next to the museum, which was temporarily transformed into a horse. Rather clever story. So finally, Troy falls. And then that third book, we talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and now the Aeneid. The Aeneid is the story of how Aeneas is given a sword by Paris, and Aeneas is connected to the founding of Rome. We see Aeneas in these three images carrying his father on his back. His father's name was Ascanius, with his son by his side, kind of representing the past, the present, and the future. And according to the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil around 20 BCE, Aeneas stops and establishes the city of Rome, making a link between those two great cultures. So now let's go to our fourth and final section archaeology. Was Homer up to something? And so I'd like to introduce you to a man who was a real showman, like P.T. Barnum. He was a German. His name was Schliemann, Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann came from Germany to the United States, made a fortune in railroads. And one of the things when you're building railroads is you have to go through mountains. And to go through mountains, you blow them up. That will be an important part of our story of archaeology in a moment. One of my students, when I showed this image, said, boy, he looks a lot like Edgar Allan Poe. And that's why Edgar Allan Poe is in the middle. Once he had made all of his money, Schliemann came back and decided, what will I do with all my money? Sometimes you wonder, right? People have too much money. And he decided, he says in his memoir, well, let me pause. One of his memoirs, he wrote 5. Oh, from childhood, I got a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey for Christmas, and I never, ever, ever, ever wanted to do anything but find Troy. That's funny because Troy never shows up in any of his writings until he's about 40 years old. He's a showman, he's a liar, he's Barnum, he's a con man, but damn it, he found Troy. And the way he found Troy was he went to Turkey and he asked people, everyday people, not educated people, where's Troy? And they pointed to a hill that was called Hisarlik. It was still in their memory. And so he decided to start digging on this huge hill, but he was very impatient. So when you watch archaeological documentaries today, you know, like they'll find a tooth of an animal and it takes them months to get it out because they're there with these toothpicks and these toothbrushes. No. Schliemann told his men, find Troy. So as they were digging from the top to the bottom of this hill, and remember going back in time, they found a medieval layer. And then they found a Byzantine layer. And then they found a Roman layer. And it wasn't going fast enough. So Schliemann told his men to use dynamite. And all of that stuff that they found, he blew up. And anything that was left over, blown up pieces on the side, he didn't care about. And people from the surrounding villages would come and pick this stuff up and take it away. So we have no idea what he lost. He was not a professional archaeologist. In fact, archaeology is not quite a science in that period of time. Nevertheless, we now, in later, with later technology, can say he found Troy. He also dug up Mycenae, the center of Agamemnon, where you may have visited as well. And this is really what he did in his own 40s, 50s, and 60s. And by the way, when his money started to run out, he married Sophia, who was an heiress, to get some more kind of an October-May romance. And when he found what he called the treasure of Priam, but actually we now know was dated incorrectly, he dressed her up in this. And because he was a showman, when he found this mask, he sent a cable to his donors, his backers, and he said in the telegram, I am looking at the face of Agamemnon. And that just captured everybody's attention. Once again, this is dated from a different period. So showman made mistakes, but he found Troy. He found Troy. It was left, however, to other, typically German, archaeologists to start doing what he didn't do, which is the fine work of dating, not to a 500-year period, but to a century, not to a century, but to a decade. And the first real professional archaeologist was named Wilhelm Dorpfeld. And in the 1890s, he came to the conclusion that there was, in fact, evidence of an attack. And now, as we move into the 20th century, the story of this period comes in fits and starts. For those of you who are really interested in Egyptology, you'll find lots of stories, Agatha Christie stories, Elizabeth Peters novels that are set in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s in this period. A great interest in the ancient world, however, interrupted by World War I and World War II. And so that's why there are these fits and starts that take place. And so the next big person in between what what we now know is in between the two world wars, was Carl Blegen, who was German, but at the University of Cincinnati. Even to this day, the University of Cincinnati is a center of studies on the Trojan War. And in the 1930s, he said, nope, I think Dörpfeld was wrong. I think the first big blow was an earthquake that weakened the city. I think the city, because it was weakened, was then sacked, which makes sense, right? So if you're fighting to a stalemate for years and years and years, and then your enemy breaks both of his legs, you go in for the kill. And he dated this sack to somewhere around the 1260s. And then the most recent work has been done by this fellow, Manfred Korfmann, who agreed with the prior three major archaeologists, but he said that he found evidence of a population that was much bigger, perhaps as many as 7,500 people, which was a very, very large group at that time. And you can, if you're interested in this, Google something called Project Troia, Troia. And so if we now use some computer technology as we finish up our time together, you can see the levels, the layers that we have reconstructed as much as we can, because we don't have the stuff that Schliemann's men blew up. And on the right-hand side, asking what did Troy look like in that decade of the 1260s? If Korfmann is right, a fairly large population around that would go inside the high walls. Remember, those high walls are also high on a fortress, a natural fortress cliff already. In the event of an attack, people would get beyond. So what then was the Trojan horse? So now, as Dörpfeld and Blegen and Korfmann are digging, what are they finding? They're finding physical evidence of things that Homer talked about. So they find, for instance, vases with figure 8 shields. You have one on the top left and one on the right. They look like the number 8. And Homer had talked about figure 8 shields. Nestor, who was a famous and elderly king, was always described as drinking from a 2-horned handled drinking cup. And the archaeologists find it. Homer talks about boar's tusk helmets. And here we have an object itself, a helmet made with boar's tusks. And on the right-hand side, an artistic depiction from about that time as well. So now when we begin to put all of our pieces together, Homer's onto something. We can begin to authenticate that. And so the Trojan horse, celebrated here on your left in a stamp from the 1980s, and that stamp is replicating an ancient image of the Trojan horse. Look to the right, was probably a representation of a siege engine that we have seen in movies, where you have men hiding inside, ramming a wall to try to make a hole that the men could then run through. So as we conclude, I would like you to read the Iliad or the Odyssey in whole or in parts. And also, if you're interested in the fall of Troy, read the Aeneid, Book 2, what we call chapter, they would have called book in those periods. If you're interested in the human toll of this story, I would recommend that you read Euripides' The Trojan Women, written in the combatants in the war that was taking place in the 400s between the Spartans and the Athenians. But to tell that story, he reaches back to the Trojan War to use as a metaphor. So I think there was a battle for control of the Aegean between a group of Greeks in a confederation against Troy, where an earthquake and or an attack occurred, a story that was told and retold for 400 years and certainly embellished, a story grounded in history but surrounded by myth. I've finished the things that I wanted to talk about. How about we have some questions and answers and comments for you to talk as well? Thank you. Well, we covered a lot of material. So now let's see what you have in mind. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at some of the questions that have been pulled up in the chat. So the first question is, was Achilles a real person? I don't think so. I think Achilles was probably a composite person. There probably were a series of kind of superheroes in that the greatest warriors, the ones who were a cut above, and maybe over time they were kind of merged into the notion of one person. But the notion that Achilles was a demigod, a semigod, the child of one mortal and one god or goddess, in his case, certainly replicated or resonated with Alexander. And Alexander the Great, who was done with his career and died in 323, saw himself as another Achilles. So certainly people in the Greco-Roman period thought Achilles was a real person, and Alexander himself thought that perhaps he was a demigod or a semigod. Now, someone has asked about the book Troy. I don't know the book Troy, but I can say a few words about the movie Troy. The movie Troy is about 20 years old, and I would say that if you want a sense for the passion, the movie Troy is much more the Iliad than the Odyssey. Remember, the Iliad is the last 50 days in a 10-year war, and it begins with the rage, the wrath of Achilles being so angry at his overlord, King Agamemnon, and it condenses a lot of things, but I think it gets the intra-Greek rivalry right. I think it also gets the sense that Troy is a formidable kingdom that knows it can't last forever. I think it gets that right. I think it gets the passion of Homer right. What it gets wrong is that the gods really don't play a big role, and that might satisfy modern audiences who think, well, the gods were an invention. But in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the gods play a tremendous role. So I would say go ahead and watch the movie Troy with a bit more than a grain of salt, but not quite a pound of salt. Another person has asked a question that interests me because I was recently in Santorini, in that part of the world. Wasn't it the Santorini volcano, not earthquakes, that caused the tsunamis that destroyed Minoan culture? And Minoan culture, remember, was on Crete. So funny you should ask that, because we were having this discussion with a guide and an archaeologist during this visit that my wife and I were on recently. And that question came up. And the answer was that they can't figure out the chicken and the egg. Did the volcano exacerbate the earthquakes? Did the earthquake come first? Was there some relation between the two? Did these events occur over the course of several years, not several days or hours? And so it's really, really hard to get into the chicken and the egg of that. But certainly an earthquake would be more apt, as this was explained to me by this archaeologist. An earthquake, more than a volcano, would be apt to cause the rumbling under the water that would create a tsunami that could knock out a big piece of a peninsula or a small island, from which we would then get the legends, the mythology of Atlantis. Do we know why writing in Greece was lost for such a long period? And did writing have to be completely reinvented, or were there perhaps remnants that survived during that dark period? Well, there may have been remnants that survived, but we don't have them. Remember, historians work with objects and written records, and there comes a point where we go to speculation, and we have to note that what we're doing is in fact speculating. So we have a written series a language of symbols on Crete. This is what's known as Linear B. And then we have from about the 8th, but certainly the 7th century BCE, after that so-called Dark Age, between about the time of the late Bronze Age in 1200 or so, and about 800 or so, we do have this new set of writing. So it could be that there were kind of pictographs more than letter representations, alpha, beta, right? But we don't have a lot of evidence of it, so that what we have to do is simply speculate. Do I think that the Trojan War has any basis in reality? I absolutely do. I think that that was a siege engine. And I think that the physical descriptions that we have of it from the Odyssey, remember it shows up in the Odyssey and not in the Iliad, and then about 500, 700 years later in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid, and now we have 700 more years of development of military technology between the time of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the some sort of siege engine, which would have had like a causeway that would have come down in order to let the soldiers run from a body where they would have been protected probably by leather that was wet down, so that it couldn't easily catch fire, and that they would run in. And we have verbal or written descriptions of that, but as I showed in some of the slides, we also have visual imagery of that. So I think that there is something there. And then it may have been turned into a horse because of the horse's neck, right? If it was a place that had giraffes, then maybe a giraffe would have been, or a camel would have been the case. But the Trojans also were a horse culture. So if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings, and toward the end of those movies, you have the area called Edoras and Rohan, and the designers of that movie very much were trying to make them look like Vikings of the land. And Troy was a culture that was very much like that. We have toy horses, we have descriptions of horses, we have etchings of horses, and horses would have been important for trade, right? Carrying and other beasts of burden for carrying things back and forth. So I think that there was something there. Let's see, let's look at the next question. Why did this battle gain the attention it did as opposed to other ancient battles? Well, it probably was a series of battles. It was probably a series of battles that were fought to a stalemate over a long period of time. And I think that given that fact, one battle that lasts one day is more easily forgotten in this long period far away than a longer war that took place, especially if it took place to a stalemate over a long period of time and was ended, if, as Homer tells us, by cunning or trickery. Remember, Laocoon says, beware Greeks bearing gifts. So I think it's the duration of the battle and the fact that it really was kind of a death match between these two big powers that made it last in our imagination. And it had a bard. You know, you need good PR. So there could have been other battles that were equally important, but the reason that we all know Agincourt more than the Battle of Crécy-aux-Poitiers in the 100 Years' War between 1350 and 1450 is because Shakespeare wrote about it and gave us, you know, some very stirring the St. Crispin's Day speech in his particular plays that are about the wars of the roses. Do we know who the gold death mask is of? No, we do know that it's, you know, centuries earlier than it should be because of where it was in that layer. How many soldiers were involved? You know, we have no idea. You know, when people say 1,000 in those periods, it means a lot. So certainly if it was a battle on a large scale over a long period of time, over the course of 10 years, thousands and maybe even tens of thousands were involved cumulatively. If the city of Troy only had a population of 7,500, why was it considered, excuse me, so important or strategic and the focus of so much attention and legend? Well, you may have heard that biology is destiny, but I also think that geography, where you are on the land, and topography, the lay of the land, are also destiny. And I think for Troy, the combination of geography, being close to a harbor between the trading zone of the Aegean and the trading zone of the Assyrians and the Sumerians, is important. And the fact that it stood up on these cliffs, high, protected topography, also made it safe to store things. So even if it only had 7,500 people, that is a great number of people for that period. And remember, 7,500 would be living within the walls. There would be many others in the countryside during that period who would come inside the walls during a period of attack. 7,500 is enough to fuel, to man, to staff a large trading zone. So numbers are relative in this period. So we covered a great deal of material. I would really like you to continue, as I said at the end of the formal presentation, by looking at the Iliad or the Odyssey online. And if you're a little intimidated by verse, there are a lot of prose translations as well, and even verse translations that kind of read as prose. So don't allow yourself to be intimidated. Jump right in and keep this course going in your mind. I'm very grateful that you joined me, and I hope that you continue to study the Greco-Roman world. Thank you.